Hi guys, JoJo Jack back, and this is the first video of a small series on the history of distortion pedals. It is a subject that I like, so I've been researching, gathering data here and there, and compiled this summary of how these little boxes came into the world. A warning, though I've tried hard to be as accurate as possible, since we will talk about some things that happened many decades ago, it is inevitable that some doubts and disagreements emerge. I open discussion in comments if anyone has real knowledge on the subject for us to get as close as possible to reality. Distortion in general is the most traditional effect and one of the most commonly used, perhaps the most used by us guitar players. The idea of distortion began virtually together with the guitar and amplifiers. As in the beginning some of these amplifiers were quite lo-fi, low power, low quality, distortion was almost natural. While some struggled to get a clean sound, particularly in jazz, others liked that saturated, dirty sound. And we find the intentional use of this lo-fi distortion from the blues of the mid-40s with guys like T-Bone Walker, Link Wray, Muddy Waters, and later Chuck Berry. But in terms of recording, it is believed that the 1951 song Rocket 88 by Ike Turner Band was the first to use the guitar with intentionally distorted sound and also the first rock and roll recorded. I don't doubt that recordings of some bluesmen even before that have some distortion, but recordings of that time are often distorted in general, aside from the fact that many of them were poorly documented, so that kind of question might be hard to solve. Anyway, many guitar players and a few bass players too began to look for more of that dirty sound in many different ways, by changing the pickups, using more wires to make them stronger, and also changing amplifiers, changing valves, changing the schematics, or even damaging the speaker. This search eventually ended up leading to high output pickups and high gain amplifiers. But let's put aside guitars and amplifiers and put a black box in the middle, since here we'll talk about pedals. In 1960, in a studio at Nashville, Grady Martin recorded the bass on a song called Don't Worry by Marty Robbins. A problem in a preamp generated a distortion. Instead of redoing the recording, they found interesting the result, or didn't have the patience to record again, I don't know, and ended up leaving it that way. The song, released the following year, was a hit, and Martin, who certainly knew the natural saturation of amplifiers by living in the middle of electric blues, found the effect so interesting that ended up using the device to record another song. The name of the song? The Fuzz, which eventually becomes synonymous with this type of more torn distortion, which is the fuzz. But there was still no pedal to do that. Later, the sound engineer of Don't Worry, Glenn Snoddy, with his colleague Ravis Hobbs, analyzed such problem in the preamp and made a kind of reverse engineering, creating an electric circuit to reproduce that sound. It was possibly the first fuzz circuit. But there is also news that in the same year, 1961, guitarist and electronics technician Orville Rhodes created a fuzz circuit in a metal box with a distortion level button and a switch. The following year, Orville created some of these Rhodes fuzz to some musicians. Perhaps the most notorious of them was Nocky Edwards of the Ventures. In either case, however, there was no mass production. In 1962, Gibson, who seems to have knowledge of this Noddy and Hobbs prototype, produced the Maestro FZ1 Fuzz Tone, which would then become the first commercial pedal. Even Les Paul himself entered the pedal marketing. But only in 1965, when a certain Keith Richards used this pedal to record one of the most famous rock riffs, the thing exploded. Yeah, it's exactly that riff that you're thinking. Satisfaction of the Rolling Stones. Since then, several companies have launched their versions of Fuzz. At the same year of Satisfaction recording, 1965, Solo Sound Tone Bender was released, and in 1966, the Most Right Fuzz Right. But perhaps the most popular fuzzes until today are the Arbiter Fuzz Face, also 1966, and the Electro Harmonix Big Muff. That would be 1971, but legend says that Jimi Hendrix would have bought one in 1969 at the now closed Manny's in New York. It is also worth mentioning the various fuzzes made by the electrical engineer Roger Mayer, the father of Octavia, from the mid-60s. He says he made one for Jimmy Page in 1964 based on the Gibson Fuzz Tone. Later, he made pedals to Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix, and others. In terms of distortion pedals, the 60s basically just experienced the fuzz. But before anyone argued with me on those labels, fuzz, distortion, overdrive, crunch, this is something always subject to controversy. Even the Big Muff I categorized here as a fuzz, some prefer to categorize as a classic distortion. Do a search for Big Muff, fuzz or distortion to figure out what I'm saying. I won't go into polemics. Categorize is less important because, after all, in general, is all distortion anyway. But there are other examples of confusion. The original Proco Rat, another famous pedal which most consider as a classic distortion, was initially announced as a fuzz. MXR Distortion Plus is advertised as going from overdrive to fuzz. The pedal called overdrive from Ibanez may be more a classic distortion or fuzz than an overdrive. In other words, companies and people classify and label the pedals the way they want. If I classify a pedal here as X and you think that is more like Y, alright, no problem. Anyway, the fact is that the fuzz pedal came first. The basic sound of the fuzz is very saturated, torn, dirty, with little definition, unclear. Sometimes the guitar player has to be careful to not get too messy, but this is only a description in words of how I understand the fuzz. Better hear an example. Okay, I know, this was just an example of fuzz. There are countless brands and models with obvious sonic differences. The fuzz face in the Big Muff, for example, has endless versions, copies, clones, variations. The curious official version of Big Muff is the 1990 version from Sovtek. One of the most commented technical differences between all these models is whether the pedal uses an electric component based on silicon or germanium to generate distortion. The second element would be more wild. But there are several other circuit differences that end up generating very specific sounds. At the end, a fuzz model can end up sounding very different from another. Well, I mentioned some heavy guitar players in the use of fuzz, but it's interesting to note that some much more light guitar players may include fuzz pedals in the chain to take advantage of the excellent sustain that they provide, adding modulation and echo effects to get a sound nothing to on and very sweet. David Gilmour is the guy that comes to mind when we talk about it. But the fuzz icon for me will always be this guy. In the next chapter we'll talk about the classic distortion. See ya!